Today we become proficient in insight. Anxiety is basically when you're worried, you're nervous, or you're uneasy about something. There's a huge overlap between anxiety disorders and with other mental disorders. Most types of psychoactive drug can give it either through its action or withdrawal. What's most important is that anxiety is not fear, although it has a very similar defensive neural network. We get our definitions for anxiety from the DSM-5 and the ICD-11, to which they state, anxiety is the anticipation of some future threat, not an immediate threat that's right in front of you. And this anticipation brings about a lot of complexity on top of this whole subject. Because what is anticipation? It means that you've learned something and you expect it to happen in the future. So what this means is anxiety is a form of learning. Keep in mind that this is a totally normal feeling to have, like it's normal to feel anxious or nervous about something in the appropriate contexts. So for trying to explain what this is, I'm going to mainly use 3 different papers, 2 of which are nature reviews. I'm bringing up these papers because what I'm about to say is against the current cultural zeitgeist, but science says this is how it works. Anxious thoughts and behaviors are learned pathways that you build up in your brain. Practicing those pathways strengthens them, but trying to avoid triggers protects the pathway from being extinguished. So there's not really a good answer for disorders, because ideally you would form new associations with that pathway that would help lessen its effects. And for these reasons, anxiety disorders are a form of maladaptive learning. But don't get me wrong, there is a lot of evidence for genetics and early environmental factors. So let's talk about fear and its relationship to anxiety. The traditional way to categorize fear makes it very convenient for animal models to extrapolate their findings onto humans. The subjective experience of fear is in the same circuit as the body's automatic responses. There's problems with that though. The amygdala is thought to be the center place for fear, but when people have amygdala damage, they still feel fear. They even took people who had damage to their visual cortex and couldn't see out of their left eye, presented that left eye with threatening images, and the body's automatic responses happened, but the people weren't consciously aware of feeling fearful. So the automatic responses are not the same as the feeling of it. What this means is you can't point to one place and have it be responsible. Like here's the neural circuitry for fear versus anxiety, and anywhere along any of these pathways, something could be going wrong. And I do not think it is useful at all to try to explain each of these structures. What I can do is describe behaviors that are specifically typified by anxiety. These will help identify when it's actually occurring, because it's the self-awareness of it happening that'll help rewrite those associations. Brains use cognitive, behavioral, and emotional domains in its threat prediction, and whether that threat is certain, like it's immediate, it's right in front of you, that's based on fear, or it's uncertain, it's based on anxiety. This distinction is important because there's different brain anatomy and pharmacology associated with both of these areas. Dealing with uncertainty is a balancing act, because you can be efficient but unprepared, or you can be prepared but over-prepared. Clinical anxiety disorders have a bias towards being over-prepared, because normally when you increase certainty, it gives you the feeling of control, which lends itself towards adaptive responses, whereas when you're decreasing your certainty, it makes more sense to prepare more. We're going to focus on 5 processes. Each of these can serve an adaptive role for normal and functional people for reducing uncertainty. People with anxiety disorders use the same processes, but more dysfunctionally. Something that's ubiquitous across all anxious people is that they more readily associate everything with threat. This is a problem because when you associate everything with threat, you can't really differentiate between what is threatening and what is not threatening. Here's an illustrative example. Pete, home alone one night, hears rustling in the bushes and loud banging outside of his house, and he immediately feels uncertain about whether these noises are curious raccoons or burglars. He remembers that only a few burglaries occur in his neighborhood, and similar noises never turned out to be dangerous before, so he's rationally assessing how threatening this uncertain situation could be. He turns down his TV to pay more attention to what could be outside, but he's also paying attention to his security system, which is silent, and his windows and doors, which are locked. So these are reliable safety cues. Nothing's wrong with his house. Nonetheless, Pete explores to reduce the nagging questions he has about what's going on outside. He sees trash strewn about and his trash can overturned, so it seems like it's just a raccoon. Even though it's still a little uncertain what caused this stuff, he can calm his emotions and go to sleep, seeing that all the cues point towards safety. Next door lives Paul, who's diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, and he hears the same types of noises outside his house. Paul immediately imagines burglars entering his home and has uncontrollable, cascading thoughts of what's going to happen and worries about what's going on, what evils are going to befall me. Everything around Paul becomes threatening. Every creak in the floorboard is the burglar getting ready to pounce. And he doesn't notice that his security system is silent and his doors are locked. Concerned for his safety, Paul locks himself in his bedroom, but doesn't really figure out what was the source of those noises. And he can't sleep because his heart's racing. He never learned the situation was safe. And the scenario is not going to change next time for Paul, so it's just constant worry. Anxiety is characterized by overestimating threats and the likelihood of them happening, paying too much attention to those threats, not paying attention to things that indicate safety, avoiding so you never update your beliefs, and then not being able to calm yourself down. And there are brain networks for each one of these. Anxiety is a pretty vicious cycle. You see everything as threatening, you avoid the threats, and then whatever that you thought was threatening didn't happen, but your beliefs aren't updated to know that it's safe, so you avoid it more and it just feeds into itself. Don't take any of this as permission to put anxious people into exposing them to their fears, because none of this is going over the techniques that help with dealing with anxiety. This is just what anxiety is. As always, sources are in the description and places to reach me. See you next time.